think it was quite successful.
Yeah, the crowd is great.
Yeah. Vamos, ¿no? Okay, let's start. First of all, thanks everybody for coming here today. Welcome to Professor Kenneth Pomeranz. And let me just briefly introduce why we are here today. So this is the inauguration of what we have called Cátedra de Historia Internacional y Global. This is an initiative that we are doing jointly with the Universidad Iberoamericana de la Ciudad de México. And this is the second event we are holding as part of Professor Kenneth Pomeranz's stay in Mexico City. Yesterday we had a very successful workshop at Universidad Iberoamericana, and today we have a more, let's say, official lecture by Professor Kenneth Pomeranz. The cátedra is part both of the Línea de Historia Global de la Universidad Iberoamericana and the Seminario de Historia Internacional that we are basically holding jointly with the Center of International Study, UNAM, and the Center for Historical Study here at El Colegio de México. So having you here was quite an adventure. Organizing all these two events was quite challenging, but we are here today, and I celebrate that, and I want to thank all the actors involved in the organization of this process. I will pass the microphone to Umberto Beck from the Center of International Study, and then I'll get it back to introduce Professor Pomeranz.
Thank you, Bani. So I'm just want to say a few quick words about Professor Pomeranz's work. So as you know, Professor Pomeranz is the author of the book The Great Divergence, China, Europe, and the Making of the Modern World Economy, that was published almost 20 years ago, and is one of the foundational works in the field of global or world history. So as you know, global or world history is something that goes beyond international history because it wants to compare very different regions, and also it wants to take a look at the possible interaction between the different historical processes in different regions of the world. So I think the significance of Professor Pomeranz's work resides in the way in which he has posed new questions about the history of the world economy and about the possible comparisons between the social and economic systems of apparently unrelated regions, such as England and China's East Coast in the 18th century. But as Professor Pomeranz himself has pointed out in several articles and lectures, the significance of global history as a discipline and even as a mode of thought, and I would add of essential works in the field as his own, also entails other important areas. For example, Professor Pomeranz has mentioned how global history's methodology is especially suited for highlighting the particular contributions of historical thinking to critical thinking in general. So there is a specific, let's say, historical dimension to being critical in general. So one example of this is the way in which global history demands, for example, a creative interplay between different time scales. So the very same event or historical development can look very different if one considers different time spans, ranging from temporal microhistories of one specific year to big history accounts that cover intervals of several millennia. Moreover, from the point of view of geography and geopolitics, global history's perspective emphasizes the need to play in turn with different spatial scales. That these range from the very local histories of particular cities or particular even neighborhoods or particular buildings to more macro perspectives of the history of oceans or of intercontinental trade or migration routes or of the very globe itself as an ecological unity, for example. But finally, from the point of view of international politics, Professor Pomeranz's work can also potentially stress what could call the political dimension of underlining the global nature of many of humanity's historical processes. So in an era when the global dimension of many current problems, such as climate change or human migration, becomes ever more evident, global history can contribute to the formation of a larger and deeper global consciousness, and therefore of a global public that is indispensable requirement for a more inclusive international politics that could be potentially able to respond to the challenges. So, well, for these reasons, I think it's a really great opportunity to have Professor Pomerantz today at the Colegio de Mexico and to have this dialogue about his work.
Okay, I don't think I need to say anything else on Professor Pomerantz. You were quite detailed. So why don't we just move on with the lecture? I think you can use that microphone. Can you get there? Or?
Thank you very much. I don't have the time to thank everybody who has helped make this visit possible, but it really has been wonderful to be here, and I'm very pleased to be talking to you. So what has become known as the Great Divergence debate about why modern economic growth began in Northwestern Europe rather than in relatively prosperous parts of China, or for that matter, Japan or India, is a very old one. But it began to take a new turn about 20 years ago, when various people, myself included, began making a case that the decisive events had happened considerably later than the conventional wisdom used to claim. Probably, in fact, sometime between 1750 and 1800, rather than many centuries before that. I'll start this evening by outlining this revisionist position, arguing that the most advanced regions of China and Europe were surprisingly similar, as late as about 1750, which suggests that we need to rethink the large differences between them that were very apparent by 75 years after that. After that, I'll talk about where the discussion has gone since that book was published, which has largely been to confirm the idea that the divergence was late, though maybe not quite as late as I had thought, and to complicate the new explanations of divergence that I and others had suggested. And then if there's time, I want to finish up by discussing some of the ways in which this new framework has been helping us rethink some other issues, some of which have implications for how East Asia in particular moved to a new place in the world economy after the Great Divergence, a place from which it was ultimately possible for them to recover to a position of relative affluence today. Okay, let's start with the old story. In the 1960s, European economic historians began moving away from treating industrialization the way they had until then. Until then, they treated it as a British-centered, sudden Big Bang. And in the 60s, they began instead to reinsert it in long stories of slowly growing markets, division of labor, many small innovations, and the accumulation of small profits over a very long period of time. And this gradual market-driven growth was surely crucial. But for those of us studying other parts of the world, it became clear that that story didn't differentiate Europe from East Asia. Because what you might think of as Smithian dynamics of growth, gradual growth based on improving division of labor, but without dramatic technological change, happened in East Asia too, but did not lead to a transformation of basic material possibilities. Eventually, highly developed areas everywhere faced resource constraints, in part because commercialization and what some people call proto-industrialization, the growth of handicraft industries, accelerated population growth. And most food, fuel, fiber, and building materials still came from the land, so that anytime you increased production of one of them, you were trading it off against production of the other. If you cleared an acre of forest for food, you had more food, but you had less timber. Britain, I argue, needed for its escape from this world not only technology and institutions, which everyone agrees on, but coal, the New World, and various favorable conjunctures. One of the ways you can see this is to look across the channel at the European continent, where in Flanders and even Holland, proto-industrialization led to results that look more like the Yangtze Delta or Japan's Kenai region than like England. And it's important here to compare like with like. One of the things that I think global history has insisted on is decentering the nation as the obvious unit of comparison, even though so much of our data is assembled in national tables. And if you think about it for a minute, it becomes clear that a comparison between, say, China and England is quite bizarre. That in terms of size, population, internal diversity, et cetera, China is much more like Europe than it is like England. And if you then think of these two macro regions as each having advanced areas, poorer areas, et cetera, then it makes much more sense to see the logical comparison to England as being, say, the Yangtze Delta rather than all of China, and to realize that the logical comparator for, say, the Balkans might be Gansu province in the far northwest of China. At any rate, by pointing out the many ways in which European development up to almost 1800 looks much more like looks much more like various places in Asia than we used to think, the Industrial Revolution once again becomes a discontinuity that needs to be explained rather than a natural, inevitable consequence of the growth that came before. So in short, what we're saying is growth need not lead to industrial growth. And so the fact that European economic historians can point to quite a bit of gradual growth in Western Europe going back to the late Middle Ages has little, if any, predictive value for the explosive growth of the 19th century. Nonetheless, among Europeanists, at least until about 2000, the gradualist story reigned. And Jan de Vries, in a particularly powerful synthesis of the gradualist story, embedded the Industrial Revolution in a larger process he called the Industrious Revolution. And the Industrious Revolution was supposed to explain a paradox. Now, if you look at the grain buying power of day wages in Europe, in other words, how much food could you get for a day's worth of unskilled labor? I'm going to skip a couple slides that I'll come back to later. What you see is that the grain buying power of a day's wages fell dramatically between 1430 and about 1550. This chart shows you the inverse of that wage because it shows you how many days of labor it took you to buy a month's bread for a family of four. This chart happens to come from Strasbourg, for which there's particularly good data. But you could produce a similar chart for virtually any city in Europe. It would be slightly out of phase for different cities, but it's the same basic story. And what you see here is that the grain buying power of a day's worth of wages doesn't actually get back to the levels of the mid-1400s until about 1840. So that is a story that does not suggest much economic progress in the early modern period. However, even though grain-deflated wages don't suggest economic progress, other measurements do. If you look, for instance, at death inventories, lists of what possessions people had when they died, during this same period, we see significant increases in the average amount of possessions people had. And so the obvious question arises, if it takes more hours of work just to get bread to feed you, why would you also wind up with more stuff, with more clothing, more furniture, more whatever? It seems unlikely at first. But this could occur in part because people spent more hours per year working for the market, generating cash that bought new possessions as well as stable amounts of increasingly expensive bread. People probably had less leisure, though leisure is a tough concept to define, but most estimates of average working hours in Europe suggest that people in the late 18th and early 19th century may have worked more hours per week than at any other time before or since. And notice that that kind of growth based on more and more labor per person, is the opposite of what we think of as modern growth, which is growth in productivity per labor hour. So that already should suggest to us that there's something different about that kind of growth from modern growth. But at any rate, people probably had less leisure, and they definitely spent less time making goods for their own households. So a family that produced cloth, let's say, stopped also making their candles. They put extra labor time into making even more cloth. They sold it and bought the candles. In other words, they specialized more and they bought other things, including things which save time in modern parlance on domestic chores. Now, something similar turns out to have happened in China and maybe elsewhere. If you look at rice-deflated day wages, they mostly fell after about 1100, with some interruptions. But circa 1750, earnings for farmers and textile producers in the Yangtze Delta still matched up rather well against England. In fact, in agriculture, parity in labor output per day lasted all the way into the 1820s. Let me go backward just a minute to briefly show you where the lower Yangtze region is. It's the darkened region there, or if you prefer this map, you can look at the place that says lower Yangtze and look at the darkened region within the lower Yangtze. That's the real economic core. And here we have, no need to pay too much attention to these, but these are English weekly wages converted into calories from grain that they could buy per day of work. And if you just kind of vaguely eyeball the numbers, what you will see, I'm sorry, I left out the Chinese ones, so you're gonna have to trust me, the Chinese ones are comparable. Our very limited evidence suggests that nutritional standards held up in the lower Yangtze and in China generally, and they did not lag European ones. Rough nutritional parity is also suggested by Chinese life expectancies, which were close to England's and those of most of the continent until almost 1800, and indirectly by birth rate. So here are the Chinese life expectancies from various studies. You see one that's an outlier, but other than that, they're mostly in the upper 30s to low 40s. These are various Western European populations, including England, and you see that they're absolutely in the same range. Rough parity is also suggested indirectly by birth rates. Contrary to mythology, Chinese birth rates were probably slightly lower than European ones between 1550 and 1850, while population grew a bit faster. Since in this period, immigration is not a significant factor in either place, for Chinese population to grow a little bit faster with birth rates that are a little bit lower, death rates should be a little bit lower as well, which means, again, life expectancy has to be at least comparable. But there is, of course, more to life than simply staying alive. And so what may be even more interesting is the evidence of increased consumption of non-essential goods by ordinary Chinese between about 1500 and 1750. Unfortunately, we don't have anything like the European death inventories because Chinese wills were not probated in the same way, but we have some other stuff. We have evidence from travelers' accounts, from elite complaints about popular consumption, and so on. And for a few commodities, we are able to construct quantitative measurements, and where I could construct such measurements, China, circa 1750, stacked up pretty well against Europe, and the Yangtze Delta stacked up pretty well against England. So here's tea and sugar. Tea is perhaps not so surprising. Where does the stuff come from after all? But sugar is rather surprising that China stacks up quite well against Europe, and the Yangtze Delta not too far behind Britain. Here's cloth. And these are particularly good examples because most evidence about economic development suggests that when an economy that's near subsistence level begins to grow, the first areas where you should begin to see consumption increase are non-grain foods and cloth. And so the fact that the Yangtze Delta is keeping pace with England and China with Europe is quite suggestive. But of course, as we all know, these parallels don't last. From about 1750, or at least 1800 to 1900, production, consumption, and specialization all jumped forward in Europe, while in China, per capita non-grain consumption actually declined. 1900 figures for cloth and sugar, for instance, are below even my most conservative estimates for 1750. We'll talk about some of the reasons for that later. Now, much of the difference is ecological, but not in the sense that population pressure was producing more serious problems within Chinese cores than in European ones. Now, we can only reconstruct ecological variables to a fairly limited extent, but again, where we can, we get some interesting results. So I did some reconstructions of, for instance, nitrogen fluxes from dry farming areas of North China and England, circa 1800, and they don't show more severe soil depletion in China. And if I threw in South China's rice paddies, the comparison would actually lopsidedly favor China. Again, this is lots and lots of data in one place. I don't expect you to read through it all, but we can talk about it later if you want. Even for deforestation, where you might expect China to be particularly disadvantaged given its much denser population, there's no clear, dramatic Western European advantage circa 1750, despite, again, the fact that its population is so much sparser. The Chinese used land and fuel very effectively and efficiently, and consequently were actually better off in some ways than Europe and declining less rapidly. So here I've got some data on trends in forested area for France, which is actually the best forested Western European country, compared to Lingnan, which is on the southeast coast of China. It's the second most developed area, and it happens to have better data than the Yangtze Delta does. And what you see clearly, right, if you look at the numbers over time, yes, as the population grows in Lingnan, the forest is disappearing. But then if you compare it to those numbers for France, it's not doing badly at all. Here, this is a second, somewhat fictional, but I think useful measurement, which is basically, it says, imagine that you took, each year, you harvested exactly the amount of wood that you could to match the growth of that year, so that you were not depleting the forest. And you did nothing with it except turn it into fuel. Forget all other uses. How many tons of coal equivalent would you have per capita? And again, you see a pretty clear decline over time, getting reasonably serious by the mid-19th century. But you see, even in the mid-19th century, the number is still better than in France. The third, the bottom half of the table is an even more sort of abstract and theoretical construct, which is, it says, imagine that you supplied every human being with the minimum fuel supply they needed for subsistence, which of course didn't happen because distribution is always uneven. But imagine that you did, how much wood would be left over to use in a given year? And it shows the same pattern, right? Clear, sharp decline in the Lingnan region, but no worse than France. In fact, declining less rapidly than France. So based on this and other things, I would say that a feature of Western Europe's 19th century breakthrough that's too little remarked on in the literature is that some important ecological variables actually stabilized in this period, despite unprecedented growth in both population and per capita consumption, which you would think would mean much greater stress on natural resources. while much slower early modern growth had produced serious and accelerating strain. Archaeological evidence points to serious soil degradation in various parts of Western and Central Europe in the 18th century, which confirms reports of generally stagnant or declining yields, though there were also some areas where yields were rising. Forests shrank dramatically, sandstorms became more common, and so on. So why would this stabilize in the 19th century when growth takes off? One crucial factor is the switch in a few areas to subterranean energy sources, above all English coal. And that's a familiar story. But it's also a story that has a lot of luck involved in it. China had massive coal deposits, but they were just too many landlocked miles away from its core regions to be economical before railways. And mines so remote from concentrations of skilled artisans were not well positioned for technological change anyway. Moreover, in 18th century Chinese coal mines, which were mostly in very dry areas in the Northwest, the problem that they wrestled with was gas explosions, not, as in England, with flooding. And it was dealing with flooding, and in particular with pumping water, which created perfect conditions in England for refining a very bulky, initially extremely inefficient machine called the steam engine. And if you want to know how inefficient they were, the earliest steam engines converted less than 1% of all the energy they used to motion. And even Watt's steam engine in 1784, which was somewhat better, was still so inefficient that in 1800, over 80% of all such engines in use were at the pithead of mines. And the reason they were at the pithead of mines is that's the one place in the world where it didn't matter how inefficient they were, because the cost of fuel was basically the cost of transporting it, which meant that at the pithead it was basically free. And so the need to pump water out of coal mines made it worth deploying this otherwise rather useless machine. Once you were deploying it, it was worth tinkering with it to improve it. And those further refinements eventually, of course, created a machine that was worth deploying much more broadly, eventually transforming any number of processes. The Yangtze Delta, on the other hand, meanwhile lacked virtually all kinds of energy. No coal, very little timber, not much water power, because though it had plenty of water, it was flat, and very little in the way of metallic ores either. And it simply never developed much heavy industry. Plenty of cloth production, very little production of anything that required much energy. So that's one difference. Secondly, Western Europe, starting with England, benefited from soaring imports of land-intensive products, especially from the Americas. As demand for food, fiber, building materials, and fuel, what Malthus famously called the four necessities, all grew with population, core regions everywhere, to one degree or another, had to acquire these land-intensive products by trading with a periphery that wanted the manufactures, mostly textiles, that the cores produced. And all core regions did this to one degree or another. But that trade tended to run into one of two problems. In a place like Eastern Europe, which had many barriers to factor mobility, and many people who were largely outside the cash economy, the response to external trade, external demand, is therefore limited. And indeed, the Baltic trade, which people like Wallerstein made so much of, grows for a while and then plateaus by 1650 at a fraction of the size of the long-distance staple trades within China. But over the longer haul, the freer trade of advanced Chinese regions with their interior also hit limits. With hinterland families more or less free to allocate their own labor, the export boom and commercialization stimulated population growth in places like North China and the Middle and Upper Yangtze, especially during the 18th century. And as the best land filled up in those regions, some labor switched into handicrafts, reducing the raw materials surpluses that those areas had to export down to the lower Yangtze, and also reducing their demand for the textiles that they used to import from the lower Yangtze. So what had been by far the world's largest long-distance staple trade plateaued and then declined as the peripheries gained population and developed more handicraft. Consequently, the terms of trade shifted sharply against manufacturers and thus against the Yangtze Delta. The same piece of cloth bought half as much rice in 1840 as in 1750, which means that if you're the Yangtze Delta and you export cloth and you import rice, you have a problem. This constrained the development of core regions. Yangtze Delta population in particular is probably just flat between about 1750, and the share of labor outside of agriculture probably fell. So these are some very, very rough estimates of population growth in various Chinese regions. Take all these numbers with a large grain of salt, but the general pattern is the richer the area, the slower the population growth. That's one reason why levels of average consumption decline over time. It's not necessarily that the Yangtze Delta is getting any poorer, but it's getting to be a smaller proportion of China, for instance. That's a graphic way of looking at the same thing. The darker the color, the faster the population growth, and you can see that the richest areas of China are essentially white. One of the things that this does is to induce probably a certain amount of movement out of back into agriculture in some of the most advanced areas of China. And don't worry, this is the only graph we will have. But if you look at the curved line, that's the marginal physical productivity of agricultural labor. So basically what that line reflects is if you have a piece of land and you're only going to spend a few minutes working on it, what you do is you throw down the seeds and then you don't come back till harvest time. Your yield per acre is terrible, but your yield per labor hour is great. If you have a few more hours using the same piece of land, you're going to start doing things like weeding, et cetera, et cetera. Each thing you do is a little bit less productive than the previous thing you did, until eventually you get way down and you're doing your 25th weeding. And that really doesn't add very much productivity because you got almost all the weeds in the first 24 times. However, at some point, your labor would cross the line that I've called P1 here. And P1 is your productivity at a handicraft occupation, let's say a loom. The line is flat because in your 50th hour, you could still produce exactly the same amount as you produced in your first hour. So at some point, the lines cross. If you're planning rationally, at that point where the lines cross, you stop putting more labor into agriculture. You instead kind of move your labor into handicrafts. And if this is the total amount of labor you do, then this much of it is going to be handicraft labor. Now let's say that the price of, or the value of handicraft labor drops through a process like the one I just described, where the Yangtze Delta has to put out more cloth to buy the same amount of rice. So you move down to P2, what's going to happen? You're going to put more time into agriculture. You're either going to have, if your total labor time is the same, your industrial production is actually going to decline. For your industrial production to remain the same, you would have to actually do more work. So you would continue developing in some sense, but it would be a very labor-intensive form of development that's very different from what we think of as modern growth. So it's a very, very simple picture, but I happen to like it both because it explains a lot of things, what I really love about it is that I stole this graph. I stole it from Joel Mokier's book on economic development in Belgium and Holland. And I think the fact that I was able to take it and plunk it down in the Yangtze Delta and have it work gives you a sense that what's happening in China is not anything weird or pathological. It's rather the normal pattern of early modern growth. And what's freakish instead is that Britain winds up as an exception to this. And one of the reasons it winds up as an exception, I would argue, is its relationship to the Americas. Because the Americas are actually quite different from either of the kinds of peripheries I've mentioned before, either Eastern Europe or the Chinese interior. In the Americas, as you all know, smallpox and other catastrophes depopulated large parts of the region, and much of the labor force was replaced by slaves who are purchased from abroad. Moreover, New World slaves engaged in less subsistence production than coerced cash crop workers in the Old World did. In other words, they specialized more, were forced to specialize more. And consequently, despite their poverty, they constituted a non-trivial market for things like coarse cloth. Consequently, I would argue, the circum-Caribbean slave region, from Brazil to what becomes the US South, became the first periphery that looked like a modern periphery, spending a lot on imported capital goods, in this case human kidnapped capital goods, but capital goods nonetheless, and a fair amount on mass consumer goods, and paying for it with continually growing land-intensive exports. That's largely a new phenomenon in world history. Meanwhile, the Yangtze Delta was running into problems with import substitution in many of its peripheries, as we've seen. Somewhat similarly, Japan's advanced Kenai and Kanto regions had no population growth from 1720 to 1860, while various outer regions of Japan gained population, developed their own handicraft industries as old domainal monopolies lapsed, and saw their rice surpluses shrink significantly. So East Asia's most advanced regions may have suffered from markets working very well, while factor endowments were not different enough among regions. This led to a certain kind of Smithian efficiency, but it also led to an increasing dispersion of proto-industry and a kind of ecological cul-de-sac. While Europe reaped benefits, perversely enough, from limits on markets and limits on import substitution, things like institutions like bound labor and colonial monopolies. Normalizing China's experience this way, then, suggests the importance of relaxing land constraints, both through mining and through the New World, for British and later Northwest European growth. Even as late as 1830, which is before the great mid-century boom in American grain, meat, and timber exports, and before the tenfold increase in England's sugar imports over the rest of the century, local substitutes for Britain's New World imports would have required about 23 million acres of land, mostly to replace cotton imports. That figure exceeds even the 15 million acres of forest that Anthony Wrigley estimates were rendered unnecessary by coal production circa 1815. It also happens to exceed Britain's total arable and pasture land put together. So in other words, you would have needed a second Britain to substitute for New World imports, and you would have needed about 2/3 of a third Britain to substitute for coal. Without such new resources, ecological constraints might have hobbled English growth, much as the filling up of the Chinese interior hobbled the Yangtze Delta. And Britain might then have been a normal early modern country, which is to say, more like Flanders, more like the Kenai region, etc. Now in China, on the other hand, ecological problems did become severe in the 19th century, but interestingly, not primarily in the densely populated cores, but in areas like the overlogged Northwest and Southwest, and the North China cotton country. There was also a sharp drop in the water table in the semi-arid north and west as their populations grew. By roughly 1800, we have many reports that wells had to be redug, and over the next century, we see many lakes shrinking or disappearing. So the basic picture that I'm suggesting here is one of European and Chinese cores that had much in common, but were hitched to very different kinds of peripheries. China's were filling up, turning to handicrafts, hitting ecological constraints, and exporting fewer primary products. Europe's were vastly expanded, ecologically rich, and set up institutionally in ways that encouraged a continued export orientation. So, New World trade, shaped by smallpox, slavery, and various other peculiar conjunctures, was critical. Not necessarily because it was super profitable, as old dependency models claimed, but because it offered a special kind of trading partner, one which allowed European cores to change labor and capital into land-saving imports in a way that expanded trade closer to home could not, and in a way that places like the Yangtze Delta were finding it increasingly impossible to do. That's not, of course, all that there was to the Great Divergence, but it's a part of the story that had generally been missed by people who were looking for origins much further back in time, exclusively within Europe, and therefore saw only one path to the modern world. Okay, so that's roughly the argument that I and others started making somewhere around 2000. There's 20 years now of additional literature, so where are we? Well, the first thing that I think we can say is that the claims that people like me made about agriculture have absolutely held up. Subsequent work has shown that the Yangtze Delta was still at about 90% of English labor productivity, even as late as 1820, even with the Netherlands, and far ahead of any place else in Europe. Meanwhile, land productivity in the Yangtze Delta was over 800% of British levels, so that total factor productivity was also extraordinarily high. So if nothing else, what we've shown is that agriculture and the things that we tended to associate with agriculture, such as alleged overpopulation, were not some sort of blockage making development impossible in East Asia. Second thing that has clearly held up quite well are claims about living standards of the poorer parts of the population. The poor in Europe are at least as poor as the poor in East Asia, as late as 1800. Claims about comparability in GDP, which is actually a measure I didn't use, and which is actually quite difficult to measure in early modern economies, show a more mixed picture. It now looks like England probably passed the Yangtze Delta in per capita GDP somewhere between 1700 and 1750, which is earlier than I had guessed, but a lot later than many earlier models, which said 1500 or even 1000. And more important than the precise date is the fact that the divergence in per capita income was clearly late enough to uphold the basic point that the key difference can't have been some eternal and fundamental difference, like a lack of any property rights in East Asia, or a lack of any interest in innovation, or some of the old Orientalist war horses like that. Because if any of those things were true, the divergence would have happened much, much earlier. One thing that has turned out to be the case is that unskilled real wages, at least in England and Holland, do seem to start diverging from any place else in the world earlier than indicators of popular living standards. Something that seems rather odd at first, but makes perfect sense in light of some institutional differences that I hope to get to near the end of my talk. Now, given that, as I said, Chinese agriculture still compared well to Europe's even in the 18th century, even actually into the early 19th, it's no great surprise that the divergence is entirely accounted for by the urban economy, by the fact that per capita incomes in Western European cities exceeded those in the countryside by a larger margin than Chinese urban incomes exceeded those in rural China, and by the fact that by the end of the 18th century, though not much before, the urban population was a larger percentage of total population in at least England and Holland than anywhere in China. So what fuels this urban divergence? There's some technological component to it, but in fact, prior to the 19th century, manufacturing played a pretty small role. If you look at the growth in per capita incomes in Britain and the Netherlands, and in the cities in particular, the big story is not manufacturing prior to the 19th century. It's a growth in services, especially in services linked to long-distance trade, everything from financiers and insurance brokers to longshoremen and sailors, while the Chinese urban service sectors seem to stagnate. Indeed, the best evidence is that it was actually trade-based demand for labor that pulled workers in Britain in particular out of the countryside, gradually raising wages and forcing productivity-enhancing changes in agriculture. Not, as we used to think, that agriculture first took off, didn't need as many laborers because it became more productive, and they went to the cities. The story is the other way around. It's urban growth pulling agriculture along. And crucially, those increases in agricultural labor productivity did not go along with land productivity increases sufficient to keep up with population growth. In other words, in Britain or in Western Europe in general, you weren't doing every last thing to squeeze extra yield out of each acre of land, which would tend to decrease labor productivity because you'd be doing things like your 24th weeding, as was occurring in parts of East Asia and in a few parts of Europe, such as Denmark. Instead, food imports increased so that you didn't have to maximize land productivity, and especially in Britain, land increasingly didn't produce anything other than food. Clothing fiber increasingly came from overseas as you switched to cotton. Fuel increasingly came from underground rather than from timber as you switched to coal. And building supplies increasingly also switched from wood to stone. So we're back then to coal in the Americas, I'd argue. Not as the whole story, but as central parts of it. The impact of coal is almost too obvious to state, at least for the British case. The question is more how you explain it. And I've made a case here that some peculiar, almost freakish coincidences are important to that story. And then there's overseas trade, for which it may at first seem harder to imagine having had the same kind of epochal impact as a new power source and a machine that allowed people for the first time to turn heat into motion, transforming any number of processes. But confirmation of the enormous importance of transatlantic trade in particular, all the more striking to my mind because the methods used are so different from mine, emerges from a study by Kevin O'Rourke and Jeffrey Williamson of the ratio between wages and rents in Britain. They argue that a standard increase in this ratio marks a transition from a more or less Malthusian world in which population increases raise rents relative to wages, to a modern world in which increases in labor productivity combined with finite demand for farm and forest products, because you don't keep eating more and more as you get richer, allow the wage to rent ratio to rise even amidst population growth. O'Rourke and Williamson find that a model in which foreign trade is irrelevant to relative prices perfectly predicts the actual and generally worsening ratio of British wages to land rents based on population trends from about 1500 to 1730. The line just fits beautifully. Between 1730 and 1800, the model becomes less accurate. The wage to rent ratio continues to worsen, but much more slowly than the model would predict. Then the model starts to be really not very good from 1800 to 1842, and after 1842 it becomes utterly useless. The wage to rent ratio rose by 394% from 1842 to 1936, when according to the population-driven model it should have fallen by 54%. The authors then, having found this in some ways not surprising story that Britain looks Malthusian into the mid-18th century, then starts to look a little bit less Malthusian in the late 18th century, then doesn't look Malthusian at all after about 1840, they ask why. And because of the kind of work that they do, they use a series of regressions to assess two possible contributors to this turnaround. The first is an unprecedented increase in labor productivity, and the second is a much smaller increase in rents than the population-driven model would predict because land-intensive imports soar. So rents don't rise because essentially the rest of the world starts to compete with British land. Remarkably, they find that these two factors come out having equal weight. In other words, what O'Rourke and Williamson conclude is that all the other productivity-enhancing changes that we identify with modernity put together, machinery, improved public health, education, et cetera, did no more to divert England from a Malthusian path in the 19th century than just the expansion of transatlantic trade did. Now, if this picture of development after 1842 has any validity, it becomes hard to doubt that extra-European trade was also crucial to the more gradual drift away from Malthusian patterns during the late 18th century, when technological change was much slower and the weight of agriculture and forestry much greater. This still leaves questions about how irreplaceable those overseas resources were and how particular institutions might account for those transatlantic imports. Williamson and O'Rourke, who are basically marketeers, just see it as transport costs fell, therefore a boom in American imports. I'm much more inclined to look at some of the specific institutional factors I talked about, like the legacy of slavery and colonial monopolies and creating a certain division of labor. But at any rate, I think there's no doubt that this boom in ecological relief for Europe, both from underground and overseas, needs to be central to our story. And that leads us back to questions of geography and epidemiology, but also to the ways in which state power was used in Britain to consistently back certain kinds of economic expansion by making it possible to suppress popular resistance to things like canal building that moved coal, to suppress opposition to new technologies, as in the Luddite movement, and by not only ensuring access to overseas resources, but creating a partnership between the military fiscal apparatus and merchants, one which indirectly benefited industrialists too. Ironically then, China had something closer to the night watchman, minimalist state of many economists' dreams. And that turned out to be great for the Smithian growth characteristic of the early modern world. But launching modern growth took quite a different kind of state, which arguably, quite contrary to Smith's wishes, is what Britain, probably the most heavily taxed country in the 18th and early 19th century world, had. Let me stop there to give us adequate time for questions. And okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Tenemos unos 15 minutos, así 20 por preguntas. Entonces, pues no sé quién se quiere atrever. Agarro como 3. No, I'm going to take 3 questions, so I can address all of them. Daniel Kent, de la Universidad de Hermosillo. ¿Sí? ¿Habla?
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor, for your talk. And I just have a question of things that I would, let's say, from my own perspective on history and change, which is completely different, which I would like to push you to talk a little bit more on, please. This picture you sketch is very interesting in terms of the myths that it destroys, these Orientalist conceptions of backwardness, of cultural backwardness, and Malthusian myths and things like that. But my question would be, what is the relevance of political or cultural or intellectual structures in these transformations? Because most of the comparative work or the work I have read is in this terrain of cultural and political comparisons, no? Because also the narrative of European ascendancy and Industrial Revolution is also accompanied by this rise of European modernity, right? Liberalism and so on. So my question would be that, what is the relevance of non-material structures to these transformations comparatively?
Bernd Hausberger, del Centro de Estudios Históricos, del Colegio de México.
Bueno, thank you for this lecture. It's very interesting. I have a very concrete question. In your model and in most of global history, which is made in the United States, you have China, you have Europe, you have North America, you have Africa about the slave trade, but the only region in the world, it seems to me, has no function, no place, no importance is Latin America. And what do you think is the part of Latin America, especially Hispanic America, in this model? Oh, it has no place.
¿Otra? ¿O sí?
I want to ask you if you have think about the difference in the concept of the market between China and Europe and the rest of the East. For China, the market is the world, is the complete world. For America, for Latin America, the market is the local market, at most the state or maybe the country. But for the China, the market is the world. On the other side, we can see that in the 19th century, the principal changes were the supply of energy. In 1876, the Otto cycle was created by Germany. Germany could supply energy from the combustion motor. Many countries take many time to understand this change. For example, England sank the Titanic in 1912 as a steam machine, as a steam ship. They couldn't apply the Otto cycle to the motors. Then the change in technologies to supply energy was very important to understand the divergences between Europe and America and China. China now can supply many energy to manufacturers to cheap prices than in Mexico, for example. What do you think about these changes in technology?
Okay.
Okay, let me take these more or less in the order that they came. So the first question is, of course, extremely broad. I think I've tried actually in many ways to emphasize political and international structures in this story, right? So the story of why these New World resources have such a dramatic effect on Europe is not simply that the New World is there and ecologically rich, though of course that's part of the story. It's a story about a set of political institutions, essentially European mercantilism, right, that both drives competitive state making drives a fiscal machine that, because it constantly needs more and more money and more credit, right? Because the thing about war is you have to fight the war now, right? When the other army comes over the hill, you really can't say, come back after the harvest, we'll have a fair fight, right? So states are driven to various degrees into partnership with folks who have capital to advance, and in return, what they give are certain things that we call rights and other things that we call privileges, right? Like a lot of colonial monopolies, et cetera. And it's a system like that that uses the Americas in a particular way, right? If you imagine a kind of bizarre counterfactual, and I admit it's bizarre, but in which it had been a Chinese ship that stumbled on the Americas rather than a European one, you know, tragically enough, smallpox would have been the same, and a huge number of indigenous people probably would have died in either case. It's much more likely, though, that China would have then filled up the area with an awful lot of peasant farmers growing mostly food and participating in local exchanges. It's the particular institutional structures that Europeans impose on the Americas, in which essentially the price of laborers don't move themselves across the Atlantic. They are moved by others, either as indentured servants if they're white, or as slaves if they're black. Those people don't move people across the Atlantic out of the goodness of their heart. They move them in the expectation that they will produce goods that can be sold back in the home country or elsewhere in Europe, and pay for their transportation, and then some. Right? So the Americas, in some sense, are set up as an export machine. And that's partly ecological, but it's very, very much political. Another way of thinking about this same contrast is, if you think about the relationship between economically advanced, in quotation marks, and poorer parts of the empire, the European mercantilist empires are clearly set up with the expectation that the colonies shall benefit the mother country. It doesn't always work, but that's the intent, right? The Chinese empire is set up very differently. The key concern in the frontiers is not profit, it's security. And so an area like the Yangtze Delta, which is the richest part of China, actually pays vastly more in taxes than it ever gets back in services. It is subsidizing the poorer and more fragile parts of China. So here's a precipitation map of China. Once you get past this line, rain-fed agriculture is pretty darn difficult. Once you get past this line, rain-fed agriculture is essentially impossible. Those areas are being subsidized by the delta, right? Rather than periphery trying to subsidize or be forced to subsidize the core, it's the other way around. And that partly has to do with cultural values, which I don't have time to get into, but it mostly has to do with political economy, with the way in which the Chinese state is organized. Okay, Latin America. Latin America didn't figure very much in the story I told today, though one should remember that the Circum-Caribbean zone is a lot more than just the US South, right? It's northeastern Brazil, it's Cuba, it's a lot of places. Secondly, the other story that I didn't tell, but which is quite critical, is the silver story. The silver story is a global story. It's a story in which Europeans get access to an enormous amount of stuff that doesn't intrinsically make them better fed or better clothed, right? After all, you can't eat silver and you can wear it, but it doesn't keep you warm. On the other hand, they are able to use it to pry loose resources from other parts of the world, right? From Southeast Asia, for instance, where that silver pays for pepper. From China, where it pays for silk and porcelain. From India, where it pays for pepper and later cloth. And those imports, as they come into a Europe, and into a mercantilist Europe, right, that is desperate to actually hold on to that silver, spark a push for import substitution, right? Every kingdom in Europe, practically, experiments with trying to create a porcelain industry until Wedgwood finally gets it right. Multiple places in Europe try to match the quality of Indian cotton textiles. And ironically, it's actually the search to match Indian quality that led to the breakthroughs indirectly to the breakthroughs in quantity that represent the British cotton boom, as Prasanna Parthasarathy has told. So those are at least a couple ways in which Latin America figures in the story. As you go into the 19th century, it also figures into another very important way in which Europe gets ecological relief, which is that it exports approximately 50 million of its residents. To North America, to be sure, but also to Argentina, to Brazil, to Mexico, and so on. So Latin America figures in the story in a number of different ways. Lastly, well, I'll take the question here to be really a question about technology. And I think the technology story is yet another story in which we have to be careful to differentiate 19th century modern growth, especially post-1850 modern growth, from early modern growth, including that of the early Industrial Revolution. One of the great inventions, or two of the great inventions of the second half of the 19th century are A, the research university as we know it today, and B, the R&D budget for research and development. The idea of a firm every year putting aside a chunk of its profits just to tinker and say, hey, can we do this better? Doesn't exist before the middle of the 19th century. And those developments, combined with some breakthroughs in fundamental science, fundamentally changed the character of technological growth from the mid-19th century on. But if you look at earlier technological breakthroughs, again, including those of the early Industrial Revolution, they're mostly A, not driven by science, and B, mostly created by artisans who are just kind of messing around. And for explaining that kind of growth, I would argue the really key thing you want to look at is factor prices, which help tell you what sorts of things you mess around and do, right? So I told the story before of the steam engine, right? The earliest steam engines generated 7 calories of work for every 1,000 calories they burned, right? The only place you're going to use a machine like that is where either fuel costs almost nothing or where muscle power, the alternative, is extraordinarily expensive. That turned out to be Britain in general, and specifically the coal fields in particular. To give you an example, so for the year 1704, we happen to have unusually good data for Guangzhou, the port we sometimes call Canton in South China, a kind of fanatical English ship captain who was stuck there for 8 months and kept data on every single thing he bought. So for that 1 year, we can do a perfect wage price index. So in that year, let me see if I think I have the exact numbers here, but it's something like, English nominal wages that year, London nominal wages, are about 4 times Canton nominal wages. However, the price of food, of simple calories, which is most of what poor people consume and therefore most of what determines wage levels, was 5 times as high in London as in Canton, When you add a bunch of other things together, it turns out that real wages are roughly the same, even though nominal wages are 4 times higher in Britain. But then if you go down the list of things, of consumer goods that are all so much cheaper in China, one outlier jumps out at you. Charcoal is 528% as expensive in Canton as it is in London, which means that roughly speaking, heat is approximately 20 times as expensive in Guangzhou as it is in London, even though real wages were the same. In a world like that, in which place are you going to tinker with a machine that allows you to substitute heat for muscle? It's gonna be the place where heat is really cheap and muscle is really expensive, not vice versa. Further proof that that's not some peculiar Chinese thing is that, again, if you look at the steam engine, as late as 1850, despite the fact that anywhere in Europe you could buy one from Watt and Bolton on the same terms as you could in England, there are very, very few steam engines in use anywhere on the continent. It's not because Europeans were somehow, continental Europeans were somehow so culturally different from Englishmen that they weren't interested in steam, or that they had such a different scientific tradition that they couldn't understand it. It's more expensive. It's that it was much more expensive to get fuel and cheaper to use labor, so they didn't do it. Now, obviously, once you get into the later 19th century, with increased use of science-based technologies, with the R&D budget, with the research university, the story changes dramatically. But I would argue that up through the early Industrial Revolution, you really want to think about technological change in terms of incentives and factor prices, much more than in terms of things like the scientific tradition.
Very interesting. ¿Alguna pregunta más? Uno, Gerardo, doctorando del Centro de Estudio Histórico. Sí, Gerardo. No.
Espero.
¿Dónde está el micrófono?
Sé que no les interesa mi pregunta, pero está bien, pueden salir.
Bueno, entonces Reinaldo.
Ahorita le paso.
Se te adelantó.
Hi, Professor Pomerantz. Thank you for the lecture here. I believe you when you say that coal and new world resources were crucial to the Great Divergence. But I want to ask you if you think that we are witnessing a new convergence, and if you do, which are the drivers of that convergence? Is again cheap energy or cheap labor?
Sí, Gerardo.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Just wanted to ask if there was a moment in Chinese history where this convergence might not have happened. For example, if the Chinese state instituted reforms or some kind of cultural change that could actually create those incentives that you talked about that happened, for example, with respect to Britain. Could the Chinese government or Chinese state back then actually create a sort of colonial periphery as the European states did afterwards? Thank you.
¿Alguien más? Bueno, no repetimos, intentamos no repetir. Sí.
Okay, let
Go
me
ahead.
take those two, and let me start with the second one, which is about divergence, and then we'll go to the one about later reconvergence. And The answer to your question is, we can certainly imagine, well, let me start with emphasizing one point that I think has sometimes been misunderstood in this argument, which is, I'm not arguing that, gee, look, all these places had fairly similar levels of development in the mid-18th century. Therefore, had it not been for some nasty piece of bad luck, China or India or Japan would have industrialized. That's possible, but I would argue by no means likely. Rather than saying, you know, had it not been for some outside force squashing them, whether that force is colonialism or something else, these other places would have had the industrial breakthrough. What I'm saying is the industrial breakthrough was actually remarkably freakish, right? And what needs to be explained is not why isn't the Yangtze Delta England, but why doesn't England wind up like one more Yangtze Delta? So I do want to emphasize that in some ways the story is about discontinuity. It's about how surprising it is that the industrial breakthrough happened anywhere. That said, yes, it could have happened somewhere else. You can make an argument that it came fairly close to happening a couple of times in a couple of other places. And for various reasons didn't. In the Chinese case, could the Chinese, for instance, have created an expanded periphery in Southeast Asia, much of which was still quite sparsely populated, even into the 18th century? Yeah, theoretically they could have done that. They had no particular incentive to. In the world in which, you know, they were not competing in a world of states of roughly equal power bordering on each other, in which it was, among other things, essential to grab resources so that somebody else wouldn't, right? They just, you know. Secondly, if you think about it, the way in which, one of the reasons why the New World can play the role that it does in Europe is that many of its early and lucrative exports were things that you could not produce in the home country, right? Sugar cane just isn't going to grow in, well, there are few places in Southern Europe it could grow, but not all that well, and in Northern Europe, not at all. Tea, so on and so forth. Things that you have to import that face no domestic direct competition are really easy things to slap a very high tariff on, right? You can imagine a way in which you can set up a monopoly on, say, Caribbean sugar, right? Charge very high markups and get away with it, right? Because all you have to do is control the ports. Mm-hmm. What could China have imported from Southeast Asia, let's say, that wasn't also easily produced in South China? Sugar? It already is produced in Fujian and Guangdong. You know, you can go down the list. The degree of ecological variability in China meant that it was harder to imagine setting up that kind of regime. Also, while, you know, a Chinese fleet probably could have taken, let's say, Java or the Philippines if it really wanted to, it would not have had smallpox on its side, right? It would have been a much tougher fight than the Europeans faced in at least some parts of the Americas. So it would have been tougher, it would have been less profitable, and the state had much less incentive to want to do it because it wasn't desperately seeking more revenue in order to compete with military rivals of near equal power and wealth right across the border. Does that mean it was impossible? No, it could have been done probably, but it wasn't very likely that it was going to happen, right? Because you asked, could the state have set up different incentives? Yes, it could have, but it didn't have the incentives to set up those different incentives. And also nobody in the 18th century, or certainly earlier than that, could have imagined the returns to setting up those incentives, right? An industrial world just wasn't imaginable in the 18th century, a world of continual growth. You know, I mean, Smith, smart guy, spent a lot of time thinking about the economy, comes along pretty late in the 18th century, and yet he writes about what he calls the steady state, where he says, once you've exhausted all the possible productivity improving exchanges, once you've done all the trade you can do, growth stops. You know, you can read through the Wealth of Nations. You know, everybody talks about the example of the pin factory, but it's really only a couple of pages in a 700 and something page book, and it's virtually the only place where he talks about technological change. It just wasn't on the radar screen of anybody to imagine the radically different world that we now live in. And so why would you rejuggle your whole political economy to improve your chances of getting that world? Not saying it couldn't have happened, but it wasn't all that likely. Okay, so reconvergence. There are multiple forms thereof, and they have different explanations, I would say, as well as different extents. So there's obviously been a very significant reconvergence over the last roughly 50 years in some of the most basic indicators of human welfare, life expectancy, right? In 1945, the gap between life expectancy in the rich countries and in most of the rest of the world was something like 35 years, right? It was, you know, already in the 60s in places like Northern Europe and the US, and it was under 30 in India, for instance. That gap has obviously come down enormously, and a lot of that is fairly, well, to us now, fairly simple technologies, right? Water purification, antibiotics, and the Green Revolution and cheap food, right? That convergence has, as I said, fairly straightforward explanations, and it's happening almost everywhere, right? Even the countries that have the worst the worst per capita incomes today have living standard, life expectancies of birth in, say 48, 49, which is very inadequate, but a whole lot better than. So that one has happened to a great extent. If you look at something like per capita income, obviously reconvergence has been much more partial. If you do a kind of rough experiment, so take the year 1913 and assign the United States, which had the highest per capita income of any large country in 1913, make that index number 100, and then give every other country in the world an index number based on what % of American GDP per capita it has. If you do that exercise, you find something rather surprising and depressing, which is that the majority of countries in the world have not seen their index numbers change all that much. Some have seen no change or have even seen a further drop. Many have seen a small change. And then there are some countries that have seen a really big change, which is to say they've come much closer to the living standards of the richest countries. Most of them fall into one of three groups. There's the periphery of Europe, places like the Scandinavian countries that were still quite poor in 1913, Spain, Ireland, right? That's number one. There are places that have relatively small populations and some special natural resource, the Gulf states being the obvious example, which one could argue are rich but not exactly developed. And then there's a clump of countries that happen to be in East Asia: Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and if it were a separate country, coastal China. China as a whole has seen only modest reconvergence. Coastal China has seen stunning reconvergence. So, depending on which kind of reconvergence you're talking about, you get very different answers to the question of whether it has happened and of how likely it is to continue. And that, I think, is one of the places where a global story gets us so far. Then we need to start digging deeper into some regional and national specificities, and to say, okay, why coastal China but not the interior? Why, to take a particular case where the answer is particularly obvious, South Korea but not North Korea? Right? I think we need to kind of continually go back and forth between global, national, regional kinds of explanations to help us understand both the reconvergence that has happened and continues to happen, and the reconvergence that hasn't happened and that we don't know whether it will happen or not. Obviously we could go on much, much longer about that one, but let me stop there for now so we can get some other questions in.
Okay. ¿Alguna pregunta más? Un par. Sí, una. ¿Alguien más? Y luego creo que cerramos. Piénsenlo. Medítenlo. Sí, vale, perfecto.
I would like to ask you a little bit more about the ways in which you think some of your analysis of the origins of the world economy in the 18th century could be somehow extrapolated or helpful to think about the present situation. So, for example, one very important part of the story of the divergence in the 18th century is coal. Mm-hmm. So how coal helped to England to go beyond these ecological limits. But now we know that created a model of growth that in turn has created new ecological limits. So you mentioned how this English story has created this notion that there was just one way into modernity. So what do you think about the ways out of modernity, or of that kind of industrial modernity?
Right.
The other question is in the same sense, is about, so now you mentioned the ways in which there has been some kind of convergence or partial convergence, but given the extraordinary growth of at least coastal China, and given the great investment they're doing in new technologies, do you think there might be a second divergence, but now in favor of China somehow?
Okay.
Sí.
Well, as far as I am aware, there have been like different waves of industrialization. For example, I don't know, the Britain industrialization was the first one, but then there was a second wave where Germany, France, Japan were part in the late 19th century. And my question is, was there anywhere in China where we can see like a participation in this second wave of industrialization, or not, and why?
Okay, so that question is a lot easier than your question. So let me start with it. So the answer to that is yes. Shanghai has a significant cotton textile industry within a decade or so of Japan. And at first, in fact, interestingly enough, one thing people forget is that a lot of the early Japanese textile mills were actually financed by Chinese merchants. And they also worked through Chinese merchants to reach their markets, which were mostly in Southeast Asia. So yes, there was a small core. It's obviously tiny relative to all of China, but it's there. And it's by no means trivial. By the 1930s, by the eve of World War II, you can see that industrial growth beginning to ripple out from Shanghai to a bunch of other coastal cities. It's interesting in that it's a hybrid of, in most cases, of mechanized industry and very labor-intensive rural industry. So it's not exactly one or the other. So you have, for instance, fairly large factories in Shanghai mass producing wooden matchsticks, mass producing the phosphorus heads, and then you have young children in the countryside being paid pennies per hour to glue the head onto the matchstick, right? So you've got mechanization, but you've also got, very uneven development even within that Chinese core. And that, of course, is not only true in China, it's true in a lot of places, right? Japan also has those sort of strange, or to us, strange-looking combinations. And so, for that matter, do places in the rest of the world, right? I mean, cotton textiles still depend on hand-picking of cotton under very repressive conditions well into the 20th century, right? So, yes, there are Chinese areas that are participating in this second wave of growth, despite very unfavorable political conditions. I mean, by the 20th century, for reasons I don't have time to go into, the Chinese state has largely fallen apart. So they're actually operating in situations of incredible instability, but they're doing surprisingly well. It's not clear from that you can project that growth out and say, if only they had been given time, they would have transformed everything, right? Because it is high productivity industry is growing, and so is very low productivity, exploitative activity. And then the third part of my answer would be to say, that's true in the core too, though in a different mix. Okay, now.
This is the last one.
Okay, yeah, so this is obviously, well, it's more than one question, so let me think about the different parts of it in different ways. The one that I'm going to simply cheat on and punt is, could there be a new divergence in which China, for instance, takes the lead economically? And the answer is yes, there could. I'm in no position to predict that. Certainly it would help if the United States and Europe would stop shooting themselves in the foot politically as they are doing these days, but that's another story. I certainly wouldn't rule it out, but we also don't know. And, again, to sort of echo part of what I just said, the reasons why the boom has not reached a lot of parts of the Chinese interior are not entirely just that, hey, it hasn't gotten there yet. There are some real structural problems, and in particular, there are some very real deep environmental problems that place serious potential limits on the Chinese boom. In particular, everybody hears about the air in China, it's notorious. Mm-hmm. The water is actually a much more serious problem. They are running out of fresh water astonishingly rapidly, which is one of the reasons why they are desperately buying up things like soybeans in Latin America, because essentially it's a substitute for farming in China, because they actually need to cut back very severely on their water use. And the place to do that is in agriculture, because it's the biggest water user. If you want to do that but not stop eating, you better import. So that I use partly as a wedge to get to your second question, which is really a question about sustainability, right? I have been accused, I think not quite fairly, but I have been accused of being a neo-Malthusian who sort of argues that, hey, look, the core regions of the world were on the brink of something really bad in the 18th century. They got lucky. They got lucky with the fossil fuel breakthrough. They got lucky with the ability to extract new resources from a large part of the rest of the world. That luck may be running out, both because of the consequences of burning fossil fuels and because we don't have there is no planet B, right? It's not just fossil fuels, it's all sorts of other things that it's just not clear that we can afford to have the whole world consume at the level of the developed countries, or even that we can afford to have the developed countries continue to consume at the level of the developed countries. Clearly, we are going to have to either make serious sacrifices or develop a very impressive raft of new green technologies, or we may have to do both, right? It may be that someday we'll get the green technologies, but that in order to get through the transition to that, we better be finding ways to conserve, right? I don't think it's going to be why should it be a one-off, one-thing solution? I mean, this gets us into other territory, but one of the things that I find problematic about some forms of global history is that they are essentially teleologies in which everything leads to modernity, and there's usually one variable, like information or energy or whatever, or increasing complexity, which is everything is made to fit that one story. And the problem, as we know, is that it's never one thing, right? So to take the first industrial revolution story, right? If you look back and look at from the very long run, clearly the fossil fuel breakthrough and then technological change is the biggest part of the story. Part of my point is to say, even if that's the biggest story in the 150-year run, you wouldn't have gotten there if you hadn't also had this other, much less modern-sounding story of essentially exploitation in the colonial and post-colonial world, extraction of land-intensive resources, right? Similarly, if we're lucky enough to invent a bunch of clever green technologies such that 500 years from now, the whole world is living at very high living standards and it's sustainable, some global historian will look back from that and say, yeah, the big story was technological change. But in order to get to the day where we develop those technologies, we better not be banking entirely on technological change, right? We better think not only about what the 500-year story might look like, but what the 50-year story might look like, in which, I don't see much hope for us if we don't also do things like conserving. So that's not an adequate answer to your question, but I think it's at least part of an answer.
Bueno, yo cerraría con ese optimismo y para levantarlo un poco vamos a tomarnos un vino. Bueno, thank you very much. It has been really interesting. This debate, I think, was very good. So let me give an applause to Professor.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure doing this.
Very good.
Close this out and take my disc.
Muy bien.
I can't tell you how many of these I've left in various cities around the world.